Good evening and welcome to Plain Talk. Earlier this week, I was asked to speak to a group of young people who are in the business of the civil society movement. The story they told was one of inadequate resources, lack of enthusiasm by their fellow citizens, resources, laws, everything that seems so unfriendly for the development of the sector. So it is perhaps fortuitous that tonight's Plain Talk is with the president of one of these NGOs. He's Dr. Troy Thomas, and president of the Transparency Institute of Guyana, Inc., the corruption watchdog. Dr. Thomas, welcome to Plain Doctor.
Hi, good evening, and thanks for having me.
Some of the challenges faced. Can you relate to some of the problems I just indicated were related to me?
Yes, definitely. I haven't been a part of civil society for very long, but in the time that I've been especially engaged with TIGI, I think I've been able to experience or witness some of it firsthand. You mentioned resources, and that's a major issue. You can't get work done unless you have the financial backing to do it. But at the same time, while you need the resources, it's also the funding from, say, international organizations there seem to be some kind of a withholding going on there. TIGI in particular has not been able to garner the kind of support that it would have obtained in the first few years from some international organizations. And businesses, for instance, are not very free with their funding of civil society organization, I think.
When I spoke to the group I referred to earlier, a short while ago, they pointed out that the laws themselves are rather unfriendly. For example, I am one of the founding members of Transparency Institute. I know that we formed as a company, but in the past, whilst you had companies limited by guarantee and therefore not for profit, now a company is a company. There's absolutely no distinction. As a company, you have to have audit, you have to file annual returns. These things they share bureaucracy in the legislation governing NGOs. It's fairly stifling, is it?
Yeah, I think it does have that effect because out of the limited resources that you have, you also need to assign to conducting these tasks that are required, or to ensuring that you satisfy those requirements. You have issues of enough people being involved, the manpower issue as well. So just in order to maintain an office and be in good standing with respect to the law and whatnot, it already takes from your limited resources.
So how do you in fact go about raising resources? You have an office, which means you must have someone in there. You have to pay a light bill, you have to pay a telephone bill. How does an organization get the revenue and the resources to meet these obligations?
Well, that's a good question, because it's actually one of the challenges that arose relatively recently for NGOs in general, with the collapse of markets and so forth, organizations cutting back on how much money they put in. NGOs, for instance, have to start to think strategically about funding, finding ways of generating enough money to keep their doors open. At TIGI, I can't say that we have arrived at a sustainable state as yet. We still struggle from year to year sometimes to pay the bills and whatnot. But we try every now and then to engage in some kind of fundraising activity. Um, but especially the short-term fundraising activities can be very exhausting in comparison to the returns that you have. But we often have to do that just to keep things going.
What do people do? A barbecue or a raffle or something? But those things take enormous amount of resources.
That's true. That's true. You have to get so much contribution towards it, and sometimes the return that you get from selling tickets and whatnot doesn't really it does not really offset the kind of effort that you need to put into it. But we also have to think more in the long term, and this is something that we made a strategic priority, but it has not come to fruition as yet. It's something we're thinking about. How do we get the organization on more? You get a more predictable kind of income,
sustainable.
Yeah, there is.
But that has been a challenge for Transparency Institute from day one.
Yeah, I'm not surprised, but I think that we can, or we should put some effort into trying to find some way of turning that around. I mean, you can't focus. What we focus on transparency, accountability, issues of corruption in society, and those things themselves take so much of your time and effort already. When you have to stop and now make sure that your door is open, all right, and then what happens? You kind of fall silent sometimes, because you're working on these issues in the background. Because that's when also the human resource comes into play. If it's not a very large body, you have to now leave that off and try to do these things to raise funds and so forth. And by the time you come back, you get a lot of beating by the time you come back on the scene, because people want to know, why haven't you said anything about some issues for some time? But sometimes it's a choice between executing your mandate, or executing or delivering on the goals of your organization, and also just making sure that the organization still survives.
But you know, Dr. Thomas, I don't think you should feel too bad about it. You got some of the professional bodies. People sometimes wonder, where are they?
Yeah.
And their failure to attract persons of caliber into their leadership also seem to be a continuing problem. But in an organization like Transparency Institute, where almost inevitably you have to take a negative position, you have to be critical, how do you manage to attract persons who don't say, we should go light on the government, or we should we need to be firm on the government, and just wanting to take, just being afraid to take a political position, what might seem to be a political position?
I should start by saying an organization like Transparency Institute, while it wants to get everybody involved, given the circumstances that exist in Guyana and that would have been here for a long while, I'm somewhat arriving at a position that it may not be for everybody. Because a lot of people are not willing to put themselves out there in that way to challenge what is going on in the political arena. And there are reasons for that. People talk about victimization and so forth, so I can understand those aspects of participation or engagement in the work of an organization such as Transparency Institute. At the same time, we have a responsibility to society, to the generation that comes after us. And I got to say, this is I got involved in civil society after I had a child. I don't know, maybe after I had a son, he's now just over 2 years old. Maybe after that, I started thinking in a more responsible way about where my input to society.
And his,
yeah, because what are you leaving for him? What are you creating? You're unhappy with the situation, but you've been able to go about with your head down all the while. But do you want that for your children?
Or
that can motivate some people.
Or the question that we often hear, Dad, what did you do about it when all this was happening?
Yeah, well, I want to be able to say I tried, I did something. I may not be able to change everything, but whatever change I can influence, I want to ensure that I do it. Something I want to clarify though, Transparency Institute is non-partisan. We deal with politics, but we're non-partisan. We deal with politics because those who are in charge of the affairs of the country or so forth are politicians.
Yes.
And we cannot help engaging them. There are opportunities where we can compliment them on whatever they would have done. But you find that that's often combined with so many other negative things that you got to be careful about, what you say, when you say it, and whatnot.
Yes.
I tell my colleagues as well that we also have to be careful about when we don't say something. So there is always that vigilance. You gotta practice that vigilance when you engaging, and maybe it makes some people uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
But I think regardless of your political view, even if you support the government of the day or the government of the past, you still have a responsibility to society to say when something is not right and to try to find ways of fixing it. Our work is not to condemn the government. We condemn the things that they do that are not consistent with transparency and good governance and so forth, in the hope that by applying that type of pressure, it changes some of the practices. Recently, civil society has had some victories. Mm-hmm. It hasn't torn things around entirely, but if you think about it, there are a few things that they were able to arrest. It brings me back to the parking meter contract. It didn't get scrapped, but there have been significant changes as a result of the outcry and the vigilance of civil society. Think about the burden that would have been on the citizens of Georgetown had there not been an intervention by the citizen.
Mm-hmm.
Think about the storage bond issue recently. The outcry from civil society and what it has led to. We saw an apology from the minister. I think that's not enough. We're playing at that level. The stakes are very high. The impact on society is far-reaching. So I don't think an apology from the minister is enough. But yet, civil society is able to have certain impacts, and by doing these things, it does not make us partisan. And this is something important for people to understand if they're contemplating joining the organization, or if they have dismissed the organization because of the views we have taken. We're not taking them to serve, partisan ends. We're concerned with society and what should obtain in society.
One of the key needs of Transparency Institute must be access to real and credible and fairly recent information. Yeah. How does TG rate itself on this measure?
I don't know that we have really thought it through to rate ourselves on access of credible, relevant information. We generally don't have an investigative function. The organization has used, by and large, what's available in the public. Of course, there are some issues with that. You might recall on certain issues we were asked to meet with people to mm-hmm. get appropriate information, but the fact of the matter is that when you try to do it, you don't get access to the kind of information. They deny you the meetings even after it would have been strongly recommended by other people, and it just seemed like that type of game, and you caught in between sometimes. There is access to information. There is legislation about that, which can be an official source of access to information on a wide variety of things. I don't recall our being successful in gaining access to any bit of information that we asked for. most recently, I think we had asked for the parking meter contract, which seemed to be a document that was held in secret. We have not, I don't think we even got a response on that so far.
Do you see this as a failure of the Commissioner of Information, as some people suggest? Or do you think it's a deeper and more dangerous underlying problem? For example, just not only a reluctance, but a refusal to share information.
I think it does go deeper. And there may be elements of refusal. I mean, we wrote a letter once, and this wasn't for information. We were contemplating doing a seminar on access to information, information to sensitize the media and other interested members of the public on how to access information. We wrote the commissioner for a meeting. We just wanted to meet and discuss some general issues, see what is available in the office. Do you have flyers, brochures, what's not, things that make information accessible to citizens.
Yes.
The response was that something to the effect that the remit of his office does not permit him a private audience. And with that, he also sent to say, I think he wanted 2 people, so he was deciding how many individuals come to see him. And he wanted us to forward CVs of the individuals that will be coming to visit him. And I thought, these are citizens of the country. Anybody should be able to access information from the minister.
Why didn't your organization go public on that?
That's an interesting question.
Because surely that's a dereliction of duty.
Yeah.
That's what he's there for.
Yeah. Well, we have had the organization has had run-ins with Commission of Information before. TIGI had published previous letters and so forth. On this occasion, I don't know if sometimes we get fed up of the situation as well, and we fail to deal with certain things. But as you say, yes, that should be something that we let the public know. So maybe this is an opportunity. I'm letting the public know that that's what we were told.
I recall when the Access to Information Bill was being proposed by the PPPC government, Transparency Institute identified a number of shortcomings or flaws in the bill. The PPPC ignored the representations of TG and proceeded to pass the legislation as it was, with all its faults. Is Transparency Institute planning to take up this question to make the legislation more effective?
One of the things that the organization has done within the last year is to establish a legislation review committee. And the purpose of that committee is to look at new legislations that are coming, that are being proposed, and give a position or suggest a position that the organization can take based on their review of the document. Apart from that, there is also they also look at not new legislation, but legislations that are already in place.
Yes.
And the access to information legislation is a key thing in the fight against corruption, in the fight for transparency and accountability. So
it's both your shield and your sword.
Yeah, that is that's such an essential issue for our organization, given what we do, that we have to take cognizance of the fact that it's limiting. The fact that you can request something, and this is my understanding of it. For matters like these, I refer to the committee. These guys know what they're doing, what they're talking about. But it seems like the commissioner really is not obligated to providing any type of information. There is a little black box there that the legislation provides. so that the commissioner can, if we want to say in the extreme, do what he pleases, and there is nothing really that you can do about it.
Well, no public official should ever believe that he's free to behave as he pleases. And in fact, that's one of the big challenges for Transparency Institute. Because if you can't get past him, I think one of the recommendations that might have been made was that you should write the organization. You should have the right under the law to write the organization direct. Why do you need an intermediary? I mentioned a short while ago, the PPP has had something of a stormy relationship with Transparency Institute. Now that that party has been in opposition, what's the relationship between the Transparency Institute and that political party?
I think that there is somewhat a standoff, in the sense that we have not interacted with the PPP on a substantial level. I think we are also cognizant of the complaints that we had against the PPP, even on the past presidents and so forth. And those have not gone away because they're in opposition now. By and large, a lot of the issues have not been dealt with. We have had a change in government. So I think the organization and perhaps the PPP as well are kind of slowly learning what the new role is in society given the changes that have taken place recently. We have not really focused on the work of the PPP recently, because I guess mainly because we have a new government, and they are sort of the people who are doing the things that we're monitoring at the moment. But if they're if the PPP engage in anything that are matters that TIGI should take up, we will. So far, the PPP seems to be, to a large extent, on many of the issues, in agreement with some of the positions we would have taken. And that's a little bit interesting. Because
sounds ironic to me.
Our positions have not changed. The government has changed. And the PPP was in government and we still had those positions, but now we agree.
Well, let me put the question or flip that on the other side. How I know the APNU and the AFC were extremely friendly to Transparency Institute, critical media. Have they changed?
I think so. I think TIGI has changed as well, and this is a little bit of introspection. I think that as the government changed, TIGI also learned that within its ranks there were people who were not necessarily anti-corruption. They were anti-corruption, but once the government changed, I think they kind of sometimes they get a little bit cold. They're floating around a little bit. There are people who have not renewed their membership. I don't know if that's the reason why we can suspect, or we can hazard a guess that might be the reason. The APNU AFC, they have been, while in opposition, saying the things that we agreed with. A lot of the things that we agreed with. So I think we were very optimistic about them going into power, and we hope that we would see the realization of some of the very things that they would have been so strong about while in opposition. I have to say to people these days that we probably need to stop using what they promise as the yardstick for measuring the performance, because that requires some kind of a conscience for you to appeal to. And given what is going on, I'm not sure how well they're aware of that. Sometimes it seems like the wheels are falling off the wagon. Procurement issues, we shouldn't be having procurement issues under the APNU APNU AFC, if you listen to them before election. We shouldn't be having certain types of. So I think some people, our relationship with them would have undergone change, because we have to tackle those issues when they occur. And I had said in at one forum, the president was in attendance. It was the launching of a book. I said something to the effect that we are a non-partisan organization, and we neither supply nor withhold to create or negate favor to any political entity. And that's the manner in which we have to operate. So by going into government, the APNU AFC should not expect us to be friendly with them, because our views were in alignment before they became the government. So I can imagine that because we have to be critical of them now, it might cause some turmoil.
Do you see this hot and cold relationship, opportunistic and just cynical politics, that they only know you when they think that you can share a common view on a particular matter?
Well, I don't think we need an adjective to describe that type of politics. We just call it politics.
So yes, do you trust the sincerity of the PPPC and the APNU plus AFC?
The short answer is no. The switch that the PPP has made from the positions they would have taken just a year ago, just over a year ago, there is a stark contrast there. And while some of the things that they're saying now are some of the things that I agree with, I'm still a little bit cautious about, what is the angle going on here. You kind of question it. You want to make sure you don't get caught in something. You get caught, you left holding the bag, so to speak. So even though the views might align on some issues, I think we're still skeptical, because it's strange to imagine that a year and a half, 2 years ago, there were these very energetic fights over certain issues.
Yeah.
But they were the ones in government at the time. Go ahead. Yeah.
You raised this question of the Procurement Commission.
Yeah.
Now, after 15 years, we finally have the Parliament ready to establish a Procurement Commission. Yet the government is sitting down on a resolution by the National Assembly, which clearly would have led to a functioning Procurement Commission. The persons have been named, yet the government seems to be treating this matter as though it's just we can deal with that next year.
I don't get a sense of seriousness of purpose. I've seen the view expressed that that cabinet wants to hold on to its no objection rule, and that may be true. I recently read that what is holding up the process now is a TOR. But are we serious?
TOR of what? For what?
For the people that have been selected. I'm not sure I understand.
No, Troy, where did you get that? Because that's utter rubbish.
I read that in a newspaper article recently, and I thought when I saw that, is that serious? Because you go
it's cynical politics, just a delaying tactic.
You go to the extent of nominating people, and that took a while. All of that was how you mean you didn't work out the TOR up to that
But
point.
what TOR it's set out? It is set out in the Act.
I
Which
don't know.
TOR?
I'm not sure I understand it, but when I read it, I was wondering if we're serious.
Now, somebody is putting wool
Mm.
across the face of Guyanese,
Mm.
because that's absolute nonsense.
Mm. I agree that it's not something that should be happening at the moment, and that should not be an acceptable excuse
You
for
know-
the situation.
Well, the head of the army, Phillips, demits office, and the next morning the president can have a swearing in.
It's very efficient.
Why- No, but what can it really take?
Mm.
Does it make you worry about the motive of the government in terms of corruption?
I'm not sure corruption directly, but when you look at what is happening at the moment, pharmaceutical bond issue, which violated the act, it makes one wonder, why not do this? If it's clearly constitutional, you went to the extent of nominating individuals and having them waiting, why not do it? The country still has to be governed, and I don't think it's good governance to have such a process held up, given the importance. What you have would be a parallel system, essentially, to deal with procurement, because you don't have the official system in place. You're keeping it on hold. So one can question the motive, and in my mind there doesn't seem to be any real reason that I can understand. None has been articulated well enough for me to understand.
You
why
understand
they
you
hold
understand
up.
the politics of control.
Yes, I understand that.
Now, where then do we go from here? If the government, after all of this, and the AFC was adamant about this procurement commission.
Yes, that's true.
Now, isn't this a breach of the pact the ruling coalition has with the electorate?
It definitely is. And that's why I said under the APN UFC we should not be having procurement problems, because this is one of the things that they were so strong about in Parliament, in the previous Parliament when they were in the opposition. This occurs to me as if it would have been the thing they would have done on day one. So my answer is not going to be vague on that at all. I think absolutely something is wrong there.
Now, Guyana has fared badly on the international scale of the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. The government has changed. This corruption perception index will probably come out within the next couple of months.
Yeah.
Do you think this government has done enough to shift the needle in the right direction when it comes to corruption?
I don't think so, and I'll explain why. On the one hand, they have done certain things that that generally the public feels would be in the best interest of the country. You're talking about I don't think they've sorted it all out, but license for radios and radio stations, stuff
Yes.
like those, they've started to do certain things. So we can commend those efforts, even though there are still some issues with them. What the government needs to realize is that it did not win the election by a landslide. So it means that you still have a large percentage of the population that would prefer to support another political party. It's therefore important for them to do things in a way that can win those people over. Because those people, even if the current supporters of the government, if their attitude, whatever, result in more positive view of transparency, you have the other side that can slip into an abyss, so to speak, and cancel that out.
Yes.
They have to be cognizant of that balancing effect. So even if you do something that this group that was perhaps previously deprived, feels good about,
Yes.
you have to be aware that you can have other people slipping into that state at the same time. And the government has to, I think, they got to take a broad view. The government needs to take a broad view. They got to, the
You're
scandals,
suggesting that they're not currently taking a broad view.
not with the scandals that we've seen. You can't afford that. You can't afford to have that. And apart from the scandals, you can't afford to be holding up things like the Procurement Commission. They've promised things like the Code of Conduct for ministers and whatnot. But those are documents that have been drafted and sitting there. So what we're seeing, and I don't know if this is the track record that we'll have, is starting on these things that they thought or that they said to us are important, but not pushing them over the limit to get them ratified and instituted.
Yes.
I don't know what that is. Or maybe we wait until the election is around and then we hurry up and do all of them to get votes. That's also another strategy. But those things need to be in place to safeguard citizens on a daily basis. You should want that on day one.
Well, we haven't got it. How does Transparency Institute push for that to take place within a reasonable time? Let's say 48 hours.
How do we push? I'm not sure I know how we push to get it done in within the time frame. As I mentioned, a lot of the times with the legislation, you feel like there is no recourse because there is so much power vested in some minister
Yes.
or somebody like that. So you can reach a brick wall, as with the Commissioner of Information. You can reach a wall beyond which you can't go.
Yes.
So we can highlight the issue, we can try to bring attention to it, but ultimately somebody who is responsible for it needs to take that responsibility on themselves to get it there. There is nothing compelling them to do it, and that's one of the problems. And we're getting new legislation coming in place with those same kind of serious issues in there.
You mentioned the drug bond. Could you explain what you were talking about?
Well, it was written about extensively, where there was a single sourcing of a bond. Single sourcing is permitted in an emergency situation, but clearly there was no emergency despite the explanations that the government attempted to provide. So there wasn't an emergency, so there was no need for single sourcing. There were other issues involved in it that were fleshed out recently in the press. I particularly I followed it in the paper, how it has developed. But one of the first things that the government did when the story broke was to appoint a cabinet committee to review.
Yes.
And I think that was almost a joke, because it was a cabinet decision, and
Yeah.
then you have a cabinet committee to review the cabinet decision. And one of the things that I see that the AFC members seem to be prominent in these kinds of things. It was Stratman, for instance. He was on the committee.
Yes.
I think it was Nagamutu as well.
Mhm.
I think so, and Harman. I think Minister Harman. So their review, you could have expected it from the beginning to not deal with the matter thoroughly.
Mm-hmm.
Nevertheless, they came out and they found the deal to be what they call undesirable.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, undesirable is a euphemism for something else, I think. But they found it undesirable. But in spite of finding it undesirable, the recommendation was not to scrap it.
Uh-huh.
The recommendation that they're going on is to reduce the duration of the contract to a year But if this thing is inappropriate, you're still allowing somebody to gain from an inappropriate deal for a year before you end it.
Yes.
And who is paying that bill? It's the taxpayers, it's the citizens, and that part, that's not right. If this thing is undesirable, if it's wrong, it should be scrapped. And I think that, given everything, should be the only course of action that they take. Scrap it and go to open tendering if you need a bond. We have also not been told who were the people that initiated this deal, because there had to be, or there must have been some kind of inside information if it's a single sourcing.
Mhm.
It wasn't thrown out in the public domain. So somebody had to find this man or this company and tell them, look, we need this, we're looking for this or whatnot, send something in. I don't know if that's how it happened. We got to speculate. But we have not been told. The minister took responsibility for it. And if the minister decides to take responsibility for it, I think he should face the consequences, as if he did the deal.
Yes.
And an apology is not enough at the level. You're spending taxpayers' money. I mean, an apology, if I come to your office and you walk out without looking at me that day, send me an apology.
Yes. Yes.
But if you're taking the money that comes from all of us, check how much taxes you pay and what's not, and you're spending it in that way, you can't apologize to me there. You got to do something else. In the wake of that, however, and this is where the AFC people come in, I mentioned.
Yes.
Minister Ramjatan was quoted as saying something to the effect that, well, what he said basically, he doesn't really see the purpose or the reason for trying to figure out who has done it now. Because, as he said, nobody will say I did it or whatnot. So something about banging your head. He doesn't see the reason for that.
Isn't that what all these commissions of inquiry are about?
Yeah. Yes. But it's also, in my view, protecting whoever would have been involved in that. Whether you intended to or not, the fact that you dismiss it that way, you are supporting impunity for corruption, because you don't even have the will to go to the bottom of the story, and you're saying taxpayers don't deserve to know. So that part I also can't agree with.
How do you see us coming out of the Transparency Institute Corruption Perception Index in 2016?
I think it will be quite similar to what it was before. Mass perceptions don't necessarily undergo change drastically,
yes,
unless there is something really huge and tangible that would have taken place. So I don't expect it to move a lot, because I also don't think a lot has changed in terms of corruption. I mean,
You don't think a lot has changed?
No, I don't.
And what was the perception was that corruption started from the right at the top. It filters through the various ministries until it gets to some supervisor. And you're saying that process is not working. Is it just not working, or is it working in a dishonest way? For example, somebody taking something out and not realizing there's a CCTV camera.
I think by and large, the government is new.
Yes.
So we may not it may not have had a lot of time pass for everything that can happen to happen. But if you look at what has happened since the government took office, it seems like you thought you woke up from a nightmare, but you're still in it. And that suggests to me, if these things can be happening so early, that not a lot has changed in terms of how government behaves. Not so long ago, President Granger said that corruption is more pervasive in the private sector than in government, and I wondered what he meant by that.
How does he know?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if there's any data that gave rise to that, or was it? But careful, the president did not say that was the result of reduction in corruption in government. So it might be that he means there was a reduction, or it might be that corruption is the same, but now he's throwing a different perspective
Yes.
on it. That it's more in the private sector. But I also read that as a deflection, because that came shortly after the scandal involving the media stories
Yes.
about Minister Harman and so forth. And it occurred to me that it could be deflection, that you're telling me where to go focus my attention away from government. But the issue is that the government is the one that's responsible to us, the citizens.
Yes.
So they're the people that we have to hold accountable. In fact, it's the government that we want to go and tackle the corruption in the private sector that they're talking about, because they have the mechanism to do so. Citizens can support it. Citizens need to be vigilant. Citizens need to give report and evidence and what's not. But the government needs to lead that charge because it has the mandate to regulate things there. So I saw it as a bit of a deflection to try to tell us that that's where we should be focusing.
One area of corruption that includes tax evasion and other forms of impropriety arises out of our political system and our failure to regulate political parties, our failure to say, look, if you want to give to political parties, you have to give it within a particular legally defined program.
Yeah.
It's a failure of our National Assembly, it's a failure of our government that we can't get the code of conduct after more than a year.
Yeah.
Now, this is not rocket science. This is not as though Guyana is the first country to introduce a code of conduct. As a matter of fact, our Integrity Commission Act has a code of conduct. What do you think is the motive behind all these stalling tactics?
I'm not sure I know what the motive is, but one can speculate that once you get into office, you enjoy the same protections that exist in the absence of these, the mechanism, the absence of campaign funding legislation, for instance. You enjoy the protection. So it's sort of a move against yourself to implement it, and you have to be selfless. You got to be thinking about the citizens if you want to do
Yes,
that.
yes.
So my question to the current government is, are you thinking about the citizens?
Well, do you get a feedback when you think that?
Yeah, I get, I get feedback from myself. I have my own views, unsubstantiated views. That
Well,
would
corruption is based on perception, the
Yes.
international index.
Yes,
but,
you
but
measure it on that
It's
basis.
true of all the countries who take part.
Yes. If the campaign funding, for instance, and that's one of the things that TIGI had latched on to in the Harman issue, with the issue with Minister Harman.
Yes.
Because he said something to the effect that these people, the people who were appointed as advisors, these people were in a position to help us during the campaign,
Yes.
and they're in a position to continue helping us now. That quote was kind of born in my brain for a while. I think I just maybe added a couple of words somewhere there, but
Well,
because it was so important to me that the Minister of State could say something like that, and then when you call it for what it is, political patronage, which is corrupt, the reaction from government was to say that what was the word? Outrageous. That the statement is outrageous. What was outrageous was Minister Harman's pronouncement. That was outrageous, and that is something that as citizen we can't stand for. I think there is a need for a campaign funding legislation. It would protect everybody. The argument that I've heard against it is that I almost said secrecy. That's the word
Yes.
now, but it's confidentiality. But that confidentiality is latched on to only because that's a system that exists now. If you have campaign funding legislation that makes it transparent, maybe people step back for a while. They don't know what to do. They don't
Yes.
want to cast their lot in either side. But I think that's good for the country as well. I wouldn't have to endure months on months of loud music on campaign trail. They don't have money to do that. They got to use their resources more efficiently and tell me something that really matters to me. But I also think a new equilibrium will arise where this is the order of the day. It will be transparent, so we conduct business above board. And it also affects what happens afterwards.
You know, the, this relationship with government, how do you sustain it so that you have access, but you retain sufficient courage, independence, and integrity, that you don't find yourselves maybe just taking a stipend in the national budget and then losing your right to say anything?
Okay, that's a good one. That's a tricky one actually, and one of the things that drives us a lot in the Guyanese society is the perception we have deep political cleavages. So, the moment you get involved with government or opposition, you're likely to get branded. People don't even want to believe that you can remain objective even if you're engaged with the government or the opposition on some issue where you have common interests. I don't think that has to be the way things must go, and I'm willing to engage with the government on issues where we feel we can influence greater transparency and so forth. But if that's going to happen, the government must know that we will continue to speak out about things that we think are going wrong. They have to understand that this is TIGI. This is what we are about. So even though we might be doing something here, it does not compromise our non-partisan stance and our general stance for transparency, accountability, and anti-corruption.
How do you rate this government's performance in terms of the measures used by the Transparency Institute and other organizations?
I'm not sure I'm entirely familiar with the measures used to rate the government, but after a year in office, I said I gave the government a C for performance. That was in recognition of the changes that came into place right at the beginning, but it was also with cognizance of the things that weren't delivered. I think they're slipping to a D grade now, because the things that seem like they slipped from focus at that point have not been addressed yet, but you've piled on a few more scandals on top of that. But they are making some progress, in my view, on some issues. But when it comes to transparency and laying the foundation for rooting out corruption, I don't think they've done enough.
Well, you would give them a D.
Right now, yes.
And as a university professor,
I like to give grades.
You love to give grades, and a D is clearly a failing grade.
Well, it might be depending on the faculty,
Okay.
depending on the nature of the work, but D can be a pass, but it's just barely a pass.
What would you like to see this government do that would satisfy Transparency Institute? That, look, this government is responsive.
Well, they wouldn't be able to do anything that would completely satisfy us because there's so much to be done. But what I want to see is the things that they can immediately make progress on: code of conduct, the procurement commission, things like those that are there just need to be done. Those things that can work towards improving transparency and rooting out corruption, that can be done and have not been done as yet. Those things I want to see. I want to hear them talk. I want to not hear them talk, but I want to see them get into the constitutional reform thing that they've been talking about, it's necessary. The powers invested in the president is too much. I mean, the president basically can do. I don't know. I respect the president as an individual, but I think he needs to handle some of his business, some of what is going on in his party.
How realistic is it to be optimistic that we're going to have constitutional reform? I mean, look, Mr. Nigel Hughes was appointed to do a report. He submitted that report. It's probably been a few months now since he submitted that report. There's no urgency.
You're not going to have constitutional reform of the kind that we are thinking of if there is no champion of constitutional reform. And the president is clearly not a champion of constitutional reform. If he were a champion of constitutional reform, you'd be pushing it, putting the mechanism in place. But all that he has done so far is remind us how huge the effort has to be, remind us all the things that need to be done. But he has not said to his people, look, this is the timetable, I want this done by then because this is important. If we don't have that, constitutional reform is not going to happen. How could a minister revise a constitution, for instance, and send it to his boss to show that he's reducing his boss's power unless the boss wants that?
So you think it has to be an independent commission?
Yes, it has to be. And it also has to take the views of the general public into consideration. The president has said that he wants that to be very extensive, but the part that I am not happy with is that there's no real tangible move towards it.
One of the features of Transparency Institute since its establishment in Guyana is the annual dinner that marks the release of the Transparency Institute International Corruption Perception Index. Are we likely to see are we likely to see this happening at all?
I think yes. I think it's something that we want to continue. It's sort of a tradition, if we can say we have a tradition after so few years in existence. But yes, it's something we should continue. It's our signature event, basically.
Dr. Thomas, the operator is just signaling that we have exhausted our time. I want to thank you very much. There are lots of things we need to talk about. We need to talk about cricket, for example.
Ah, yes. I've seen some rumblings.
Yes, we need to talk about what's happening in the regions. We need to talk about how society and the people can help to strengthen Transparency Institute. So I hope you will be willing to accept my invitation to come back again on Plain Talk.
All right, sure. And then maybe I can bring some of my colleagues who might be able to go deeper into some of the issues.
They'd be welcome.
Yeah.
So again, thank you very much. Operators and viewers, thank you, good night, and I'll see you next week.